If you ever see a cabin like this in the middle of the forest, don't assume it's empty. Places like this aren't built by accident, and they're rarely abandoned for no reason. The stories you're about to hear come from people who thought they were alone until the forest started listening. Some heard footsteps, some saw the light turn on, and some realized the cabin was never meant to keep things out. Lower the volume. Watch carefully, because once you notice what's hiding in the trees, you won't be able to unsee it.
Before we get into today's stories, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, ZocDoc. A lot of the stories I cover start with something small, like a feeling you brush off, or a detail you tell yourself isn't important. And honestly, that's not too different from how a lot of us treat our own health, like a weird pain or just the mental stress of knowing you probably should see a doctor, but putting it off anyway. I caught myself doing the same thing, telling myself I'd deal with it tomorrow. That's when I used ZocDoc, and it actually made the whole process painless. ZocDoc is a free website that lets you search for in-network doctors, compare them by specialty, see real appointment availability, and book instantly. In many cases, you can get in within just a couple of days. You can read verified patient reviews, check out doctor profiles, and choose someone you're genuinely comfortable with no awkward phone calls. What I loved was being able to find a doctor who had next-day availability and reviews that specifically mentioned listening and taking patients seriously. That matters because walking into an appointment already feels stressful enough. So if you've been avoiding a doctor's visit or just want an easier way to find someone you actually trust, head over to ZocDoc.com/Mr. Nightmare and see what's available in your area. It only takes a few clicks. I went camping alone last winter with my dog Roscoe, and it's something I'll never do again. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to get away from people. I loaded my truck with my gear and drove up a long, narrow trail that cut deep into a state forest. The road was barely maintained, covered in packed snow and ice, and there were no other cars anywhere. After driving for almost an hour, I parked at a small pull-off that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. From there, I hiked another 20 minutes with my pack and Roscoe until I reached a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The snow was deep and untouched. There were no footprints or signs of anyone else being around recently. That was what I wanted. I set my pack down, cleared a spot for a tent, and let Roscoe wander around while I worked. He stayed close, sniffing the snow in the trees and just jumping around playing. I pitched the tent, staked it down hard because the ground was frozen, and laid out my sleeping pad and winter-rated sleeping bag inside. I knew it was going to be a cold night, well below freezing, so I layered properly. Thermal base layers, thick socks, a fleece, and a heavy jacket stayed on even after camp was set. Once the tent was ready, I gathered dead wood and built a small fire pit. I started a fire and let it burn down until I had a steady flame. I cooked dinner over it, just a simple meal, and sat on a log eating while Roscoe lay near the fire. The woods were quiet in that deep winter way where sound feels almost non-existent. I learned a long time ago from my dad that snow actually absorbs sound. After I ate, Roscoe suddenly stood up and started barking toward the trees. It didn't concern me at first. Deer were everywhere out there, and he had barked at them before. I told him to relax, and he did after a minute, sitting back down. I checked the time and decided I'd stay up a bit longer by the fire before turning in. I always carried a handgun when camping in remote places, and it was holstered at my side like it always was. I felt fine at that point. About 20 minutes later, Roscoe started barking again, louder this time. Then I heard it too, footsteps moving through the snow somewhere out in the woods. I stood up and listened. The steps stopped, then started again. Roscoe went from barking to growling, then suddenly went silent. He stood staring straight ahead toward the trees. That was when I felt uneasy. I followed his gaze and saw a shape at the edge of the tree line. Someone was standing there, half hidden in the darkness, just barely lit by the fire. I called out, saying that he scared me, and telling Roscoe it was okay. The figure didn't move at first. Then he stepped forward slightly, enough for me to see that it was a man. He asked what I was doing out there, that deep in the woods. His tone wasn't friendly. I told him I was just getting out into nature with my dog. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there watching me. I could feel the situation turning wrong. I told him calmly that I was armed. The man slightly laughed and said something about me threatening him instead of inviting him to join me, and asked where my hospitality was. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness, his footsteps fading into the woods. I stood there for a long time after that, staring at the trees. Roscoe stayed close to me. I didn't like any of it, but eventually I told myself he was gone. I put out the fire carefully, throwing snow on it and stirring the ashes until there was nothing left that could glow. I didn't want light drawing attention. I crawled into my tent and sealed it up. Inside, I did everything I could to stay warm. I laid my sleeping pad down to keep the cold ground from draining heat from my body. I stayed fully dressed, pulled on a knit hat, and cinched my sleeping bag tight around my shoulders. I kept a hand warmer near my core and another near my feet. Roscoe curled up next to me, his body heat helping more than anything. I lay there listening to the woods, or rather, the extreme silence. After a while, Roscoe started growling again. Then I heard what he was growling at. Footsteps in the snow. They stopped and Roscoe quieted, but his ears were still perked up. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time, and slower than before. They came right up to the tent and stopped. Roscoe began howling loudly. I whispered for him to stop, terrified of drawing attention. When he did stop, he went back to growling. Whoever it was just stood outside the tent. I could hear subtle movement, like the shift of weight in the snow. I had my gun in my hand now, but I didn't want to make threats. I didn't want to be forced to follow through with the threats. I've never actually shot anyone, and I don't think I have it in me to kill someone even in self-defense. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cocked the gun and said clearly that I had a gun and that whoever was there needed to leave now. But realistically, who else could it have been besides that creepy guy from before? There was silence for a few seconds. Then I heard footsteps again, moving away from the tent. Slowly at first, then faster, before disappearing into the woods. I didn't unzip the tent to look out. I stayed frozen for hours. Roscoe stayed alert the entire time, which was the only reason I even felt remotely comfortable eventually nodding off. I certainly wouldn't have if I were alone. I barely slept, drifting off only in short bursts. When the sky finally began to lighten, I packed up as fast as I could at the crack of dawn. We hiked back to my truck and drove away. I never went back to that part of the woods again, and I never will. Creeps like that guy really make life scary sometimes, and remind you that you can never really let your guard down. July 4th weekend in 2025. I drove from Melbourne, Florida to Charleston, South Carolina to visit a good friend named Mark I hadn't seen in years. He was there on an internship for his law program and staying in a house in the city. I was visiting for the weekend and spending the night downstairs on a couch by some windows. After a smooth drive, I arrived in Charleston, and we played some pickleball before nightfall. When the night settled in, I went back downstairs to the couch by the windows that faced another apartment building and a small labyrinth of alleyways with an abandoned house across the street. The next day, after playing more pickleball in the morning and hanging out, we went to the main Charleston market. We walked through it and eventually came out near the docks by the water. That's when we saw him. A man in a wedding suit was shambling down the road near the water. He wore a crisp bow tie and clean dress shoes, and his suit looked freshly pressed. He had long black curly hair and a tan complexion. The market behind us was loud and busy, yet this man moved alone across the street with a slow, detached movement. He didn't notice us and seemed to be in his own world. If we crossed the street, we would have walked straight into him. Instinctively, I wanted to avoid him. I grabbed Mark by the arm and told him we were not crossing. We walked to the right, deeper into the city, and picked up our pace. He was moving slowly, so we created distance easily. I told Mark it was strange and that the guy didn't look homeless. His clothes were too clean, too crisp. Something about him felt wrong. Mark agreed. We kept walking for a while. A few streets later, on another busy stretch of Charleston, we looked toward a shop and saw him again. That same man, with the same shambling movement. He was far down the street, diagonal to us, moving at the same slow pace. Somehow, he caught up to us, even though there was no clear way he could have reached that spot without us seeing him. I pointed him out to Mark, and we both stared. It made no sense. He was in a completely different part of the city, but moving exactly the same way. We pushed it aside and kept exploring Charleston. The next day was July 4th, and that night we watched the fireworks on an island about 20 minutes from the city. By then, we had mostly forgotten about the man in the suit. We assumed he was just some strange person wandering around, but something about him set off alarm bells. It felt out of place, wrong. That night, we decided to go on a ghost tour, which we had already planned before the trip. It was my last night in Charleston on July 5th, and the city was packed. It was a busy Saturday night with crowds everywhere, lights pouring from restaurants, and that historical atmosphere Charleston has after sunset. We finished the ghost tour and walked through the main area of the city, filled with restaurants and nightlife. The street was crowded, and a particular wave of people was moving toward us, and quite fast. As this group approached, both Mark and I noticed something at the exact same moment. It was him, the same man in the same wedding suit, with the same bow tie and the same black curly hair, shambling in the middle of the crowd as if he had been placed there. He stood out instantly. His movement was completely different from everyone else. He didn't blend in. No one around him noticed him. Two people were walking right beside him, and he brushed between them without either of them reacting. He kept the same slow, unsettling pace while the entire crowd moved normally around him. He glanced at us for a brief second, and then continued forward. It was as if he was tied to the movement of the crowd without truly being part of it. Mark and I looked at each other in shock. It made no sense. He didn't belong there, and something in both of us recognized that immediately. We watched him move down the street until the crowd thinned out. When it did, we saw him clearly, still shambling, still moving at that same unnatural pace, disappearing into a darker side street until he turned a corner. We were quiet, not panicking, but deeply unsettled. The same man in the same suit appearing multiple times in different parts of the city, always shambling, always out of place. Both of us knew something was wrong. Later that night, we returned to the house. Mark went upstairs to his room, and I went downstairs to sleep. I shut the blinds and tried to settle in. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a tap on the window. I froze. After a few moments, I forced myself to look. I lifted the blinds slightly and looked down the alley. At the far end, I saw the back of a man turning the corner. It was him again. He moved out of sight, but right before he disappeared, he looked back toward the window. I told Mark the next morning. I explained what I saw, and even he admitted that the entire experience was disturbing. He doesn't believe in anything paranormal, and he's extremely logical and grounded, but even he was shaken. As for me, I'm more spiritually sensitive, and this experience stayed with me, and I also know it's with Mark months later. We'll never forget that weekend. The man in the suit felt real and unreal at the same time. Something about all of it was off. I drove home to Florida on July 6th, and the image of him turning that corner has stayed with me ever since. I never thought I would be the kind of person who double-checks door locks or memorizes the sounds of my own floorboards, but that changed after 1 week last winter. I live alone in a small house I bought a few years ago, and my routine has been boring and predictable. I work from home, order groceries, go to the gym late at night, and I don't talk to my neighbors much at all. That routine is why it took me longer than it should have to realize something was wrong. It started with a noise I heard around 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was half asleep on the couch with the TV still on low when I heard what sounded like a soft thump near the back of the house. It wasn't loud enough to scare me, and my first thought was that something had fallen in the kitchen or maybe the house had shifted. We all hear sounds like that in the house or apartment once in a while, right? I muted the TV so I could listen. Nothing else happened. I checked the back door, made sure it was locked, and went to bed. The next morning, I noticed the back door felt different when I opened it. The deadbolt still worked, but the handle felt loose, like it had been twisted too hard. I made a mental note to fix it later. That night, I went to the gym around 11 p.m. like I usually do. Side note, I like an empty gym, and I got back around midnight to 12:30. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my porch light was off, yet I always leave it on. I stood there in my car for a few seconds trying to remember if I had turned it off earlier, and I convinced myself I probably did. Inside, everything looked normal. I walked through every room just doing an innocent little analysis before going to bed, something I had never done before. On Thursday morning, I woke up to my alarm and noticed my phone was at 12% battery. I always charge it overnight, and I clearly remembered plugging it in. The cable was still connected to my phone, but the charger was no longer connected to the outlet. Weird. I told myself I must have knocked it loose in my sleep, but that explanation didn't really make sense because my phone was still on the nightstand, not in bed with me. At that moment, my only explanation was I picked up my phone in the middle of the night, accidentally yanked it off the outlet without realizing, and set it back down. I started paying closer attention after that. That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting in the dark with the TV off, just listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard slow thumps coming from the back of the house. Footsteps? I asked myself. Nah, it can't be. I held my breath, but the thumps seemingly stopped. After a while, I convinced myself the thumps came from outside. I'm in the suburbs, there's of course other people around, even at night. The next day, I found muddy shoe prints on the floor near the back door. The thing is though, the footprints weren't clear, like I couldn't distinctly make out patterns of the bottoms of the shoes, which made it look like someone tried to wipe them off before walking around. My stomach literally skipped a beat. I stood there staring at them, trying to understand how they got there. I hadn't had anyone over. I hadn't gone outside in muddy shoes. I checked the back door again, and this time I noticed faint scratch marks around the lock, like someone had used something thin to pry at it. I called the locksmith and told him I thought my lock was failing. I didn't say anything about the footprints. He replaced the lock that afternoon and told me everything should be fine. That night, I pushed a chair under the back door handle and slept with my bedroom door locked, something I never did before then. I woke up just before 4 in the morning to the sound of something tapping lightly on my bedroom door. It wasn't a knock. It sounded like someone testing the door with their fingertips. I stayed completely still, staring at the door, my eyes burning because I refused to blink. The tapping stopped after a minute, and then I heard soft footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, the chair was still under the back door, but the back door itself was unlocked. The new lock wasn't damaged, it had just been turned, and that's when reality truly set in. I wasn't just imagining these things like I thought I was because I was tired. Someone had been inside my house while I was asleep and knew how to unlock the door from the inside. I called the police and tried to explain without sounding insane. They checked the house, looked around the yard, and told me there was no sign of forced entry. But yeah, that was kind of obvious given that I changed the lock. They suggested I might have unlocked the door myself without remembering. I knew that wasn't true, but there was nothing they could do either way. That night, I stayed awake with all the lights on and a kitchen knife on the table in front of me. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something from down in the basement. The basement door, which was just outside of the kitchen, was cracked open. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I stared down the hallway to the cracked open basement door. I walked over to it, peeked down through just what the crack in the door would allow me to see, and I swear it was not my imagination. I saw either at the bottom of the stairs or maybe one of the bottommost steps, the outline of someone standing there. I don't know if they were looking up or not. When I realized what I was looking at, I slammed the door shut and sprinted out to my car. I sat in my car as I once again called 911. After police showed up a second time, they entered while I waited in one of their cars. They brought him out of the house in handcuffs a few minutes later. He was barefoot and wearing dark clothes that looked like they had been slept in. He didn't look at me once. I just don't think that he noticed me in the back of the car. They put him in the back of the other car and shut the door. I stayed outside while more officers went back in, and I refused to look at the guy in the back of the car. I was actually shaking. Even as I talked to the officers, I was stuttering in shock. It took longer than I expected for them to finish the rest of their search. When one of the officers finally came out, he asked how long I had lived there. I told him a few years. He nodded and wrote something down. He asked what time I usually went to the gym and which nights. I told him. He looked back at the house and told me they found food wrappers and bottled water behind the furnace in the basement, along with a phone charger plugged into an outlet down there. He said it looked like someone had been sleeping on the concrete using old insulation as padding. The man hadn't spoken a word to the officers. The main officer I was talking to told me the likely charges the man would be facing, but that ultimately it would be up to the district attorney. Eventually, they told me I could go back inside. It was days later that I was going through my camera roll to send my friend something when I found a very, very disturbing picture. At first, I had to process how a picture like this could be taken. It was a picture of me, in my bed, sleeping, taken at 3:11 a.m. It was the same night that I woke up in the morning to my phone being unplugged from the wall outlet. The nightmare became real all over again. I contacted the unit listed on the incident report, and they asked me to come in to digitally transfer the photo for supplemental evidence. I was told that with this photo, he'd likely be facing additional charges such as stalking or even being registered as a sex offender for life. All good things to hear. It doesn't save me, however, from the trauma I'll forever have to live with thinking back to this shit. I'll never be able to go down into a basement alone at night again in my life. This is one of my favorite topics that I've covered in the past. New house stories in which unsuspecting people who just moved into their new homes discover something or perhaps someone that shouldn't be there. But before getting into those, I want to thank DraftKings for sponsoring this video. DraftKings is an online, real money casino that lets you play whenever and wherever legally permitted. Choose from over 300 real money games, slots, blackjack, roulette, and live dealer games. With more real money games added regularly, DraftKings Casino is changing the game with new ways to play. DraftKings is safe, secure, and reliable, and if it's not yet available in your state, check out DraftKings Daily Fantasy app, where you have a shot at winning cash prizes all season long. Head to the DraftKings Casino app right now and sign up using promo code Mr. Nightmare, and when you play just $10, you'll instantly receive $100 in casino credits. This happened a few years ago, but it still gives me an unsettling feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because I feel like it's been long enough since it happened, and I won't risk anything by putting it on the internet. Back then, my wife and I had just moved into the suburbs from the city. We just had our third kid, and between the baby stuff, the toys, and the general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described it as the kind of place where you'd feel fine leaving the doors unlocked. The house itself wasn't massive, but it was definitely a step up from the tiny space we'd previously been living in. One of the features that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had this beautiful, slightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered around. They were weathered, a little eerie looking, like something out of Game of Thrones. I know it sounds weird, but my wife and I loved it. Said it gave our yard character. I was pretty indifferent, so I left everything as it was, statues and all. I figured it was less work for me, which I was never going to complain about. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, taking in the yard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing toward us, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, but I didn't really know for sure. I didn't think much of it, and just assumed I was misremembering things. The next morning, I looked out the window again, and that's when I noticed it. Another statue had turned around, again facing away from the house. This time I knew something was up. I had never been more sure about anything in my life. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off and said she hadn't noticed anything. I thought maybe it was my son Jimmy. He was a little prankster back then, always up to something. But when I asked him, he just looked at me like I was nuts. I doubted he'd do something like that anyway. I knew something was going on though, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger problems to worry about. I don't like admitting it, but money was really tight during that time, and I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. A few days went by without anything strange, and I started to relax. But then, one evening, I looked out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the house, just standing there. It was a freakish sight, like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but part of me could feel all those eyes looking at me. My breathing went shallow. I couldn't decide whether it was more scary or bizarre. I went outside to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. Before opening up the back door, I took a few nervous glances around the yard to make sure there was no one out there. It was daylight, but I was paranoid. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door and go inspect the statues. I went to lift one of them and immediately realized something. Those statues were heavy, way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even budge one of them on my own. As I was debating what to do, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked out as I was. She suggested maybe some of the other neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block, but that explanation literally made no sense. We had met all of the neighbors, and they all seemed like fairly normal people. Plus, I had trouble believing that anyone sane would do this to a family with young children. This was harassment, not some harmless prank. We ended up calling the police, but as you might expect, they couldn't do much. They suggested putting up some security cameras, but we didn't have the money for that. I told the cops we would, but on the inside, I was really reluctant to do something so drastic. They left, and I guess I felt a little better, even though my wife was still extremely shaken up. My wife and I did everything we could to hide the situation from our kids. Say what you will, but we didn't want to scare them. Nothing happened the next day, or the next. I speculated that the cops had scared whoever was there away, which did track on many levels. So we tried to forget about it, even though neither of us really felt comfortable. I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right. Maybe it had just been a prank or something. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves, though. I was on edge, looking out the windows every time I passed by, half expecting to see the statues somewhere else. I hope no one ever has to experience the sensation of feeling unsafe in your own home. A few days passed without incident. I started thinking the nightmare was over, and for the first time in a while, the house was actually starting to feel like home. I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was definitely a weekend since my kids didn't have school. After some breakfast, I went outside to play in the yard with my kids, and that's when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped my son when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to stay in the house with them. I don't know what came over me. I'm not that brave of a guy, but I started sprinting through the garden, screaming threats at whoever had vandalized my house. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I was looking for a fight. No one was anywhere in my yard, though. Eventually, I gave up looking. As I was walking back towards the house, the adrenaline in me turned to outright fear. This was serious. Someone had left a direct message meant to scare us. They could have meant us harm, and I knew the situation was only going to escalate from there. The police came again and took down another report, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I insisted that they stay on the property in case those people came back, but they told me they didn't have enough evidence to waste resources like that. As far as they knew, some teenage delinquents could have been behind the graffiti. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me they'd make sure a patrol officer was nearby, which I guess was some kind of consolation. My wife was twice as upset as I was, so I reassured her that we'd be okay, even though I was freaking out internally. That night, I was in the kitchen when I heard my wife scream from the living room. I ran in, and she was standing by the window pointing outside. I looked, and my stomach dropped. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, each of them wearing white face coverings. They were dancing around in this strange, jerky way, almost like puppets. We just stood there, watching them, too shocked to move. It was terrifying. I don't know what they were trying to accomplish, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I snapped out of my haze and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we had. I basically screamed at my wife to call the police, and while she was doing that, I ran out the back door with a knife in my hand. I screamed like a clinically insane person and took one step toward them before instantly regretting it. There were 5 of them and 1 of me. They could have been armed. Before anything else could happen, I turned and ran back inside the house like a coward. The knife must have scared them though, because they stopped dancing and ran into the garden, out of sight. I told my wife to run upstairs, find the kids, and hide, and I guarded the back door in case they tried to break in. By the time the police arrived, those people were gone. The police did a thorough search but couldn't find any trace of them. That was the last straw. I didn't care about the costs. I bought and installed security cameras the next day. My wife was hysterical for weeks after that, begging me to let us move somewhere else. I told her that if one more thing happens, that we would, but that we'd probably be screwing ourselves financially if it came to that. Luckily, the cameras must have done the trick, because those people never returned, and we never had another incident occur on the property. The scariest thing, though, is that we still live in the same house and never got an explanation for what happened. My wife Taylor and I recently moved out of our old home. She didn't like being so close to her family and wanted to put some distance between us and them, so that's what we did. We don't have kids, and she stopped working ages ago, so she was relatively amenable to my suggestions about where to move. I'm an electrician, so bouncing around isn't much of a problem for me. We eventually settled on New Mexico. We'd both been rural people all our lives, so it wasn't that drastic of a lifestyle change. That was about 3 months ago, give or take. We found a fantastic deal on a place way out in the country. The house is honestly bigger than we really need, especially since it's just the 2 of us and our black lab Lola. But honestly, we figured we'd make use out of the extra space, maybe even host some of the friends we'd make. We'd been settled in for a few months when I started noticing something odd. The upstairs lights kept tripping circuits, but the rest of the house would still have power. After this happened once or twice, I knew exactly what the problem was. Like I said, I'm literally an electrician, so this kind of stuff is my bread and butter. I figured it would be an easy fix, just a matter of rearranging some of the load on the breaker, which in all likelihood was downstairs. Times like those make me happy that I'm the type of guy who knows how to fix things. To be honest, I hadn't spent that much time in the basement since we moved in. I didn't really have a reason to. We'd looked it over briefly when the realtor showed us the place, but I didn't pay much attention. Come to think of it, I don't think I'd been in there one time since then. Anyway, I walked down the stairs and started looking around for the main breaker. The basement was pretty cluttered and definitely not the type of space that could be easily used. It looked more like a storage room than a basement. Eventually, I figured out where the main was and started futzing around. After about 10 minutes, I realized where the load imbalance was and told myself I'd rewire it when I had more time. At that point, I was about to go upstairs when curiosity got the better of me. I figured since I was down in the basement already, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have a look around. After all, this is my house, and it was honestly a little strange that I didn't know every square inch of it. Like I said, most of it was filled with old furniture and a bunch of junk. There wasn't anything particularly interesting down there, and I eventually concluded that trying to transform it into a usable space would be way too much of a hassle. That's when I noticed something odd. In the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old wooden chairs, was a large metal door. It was strange because this wasn't just any door. It looked industrial grade. It was also a lot taller than most normal doors would be, and seemed pretty thick too. I walked over to it, and my suspicions were confirmed. It looked like the type of door you'd see securing a walk-in safe or some kind of panic room. My first thought was maybe it was a tornado shelter or storm room or something, but that would be a weird surprise. You'd think the realtor would have mentioned a feature like that. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. I immediately went upstairs and started rummaging through the drawer of keys the previous owner had left behind in case we locked ourselves out or something, but none of them worked on the door. I must have tried like 15 keys or something, but no luck. I eventually told Taylor about it, and she was just as curious about it as I was. I'm still not sure how, but she worked her magic, and we were able to get in contact with the previous owners. It was that exact phone call that took me from curious about the situation to downright concerned. They were a little odd on the phone and would pause every so often, like they were thinking carefully about what they were saying or trying not to say too much. Part of me wishes I had recorded the conversation, but hindsight is 20/20. When I asked about the door, they got quiet. Eventually, the wife said it was just a safe room in case of a tornado. I told her that was great, but we were unable to use it since it was locked. After another pause, she claimed they'd lost the key and told us to just ignore it. I thought that was extremely unlikely, since they had literally left us keys to random doors that we'd probably never need to lock. The way she said it gave me a really bad feeling in my gut too, but there was nothing I could do. We ended up hanging up almost immediately after that, as they were definitely not trying to make small talk. Taylor tried to laugh it off, told me I was overthinking it, but I couldn't let it go. Over the course of the next few weeks, I would occasionally wander down the stairs and just stare at that door, wondering what could be inside. I tried everything I could think of to open it, even some tricks I'd picked up from work, but it was no use. The lock was solid. I ended up giving up for about a week, but the curiosity ultimately got the better of me. Fast forward to 2 days ago, when things took a wild turn. After my wife's wishes, I decided to hire a locksmith. He came over, and I let him do his thing down there. After about 30 minutes, I went downstairs to check on him. He told me that the lock was unusually complex for a simple panic room. Those were his exact words. I was worried he wouldn't be able to get it open, but to my surprise, he actually managed to crack it after another half hour. I wish he hadn't. Inside, the room was set up like some kind of shrine. There were old black and white photographs on the walls, all covered in strange symbols that I didn't recognize. In the center was a chair, just facing the wall. It looked like someone had spent a lot of time sitting there, just staring at nothing. In one corner, there was a cot with crumpled blankets, and it smelled stale and kind of gross. Then I noticed the trash. Empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles. The realization smacked me in the face. Someone had actually been staying down there, and not that long ago. I was dumbfounded. I didn't think the situation could get much worse, but of course, that's what happened. As I was trying to take it all in, I noticed a second door on the far right side of the room. It was small and half hidden by the minimal light, but it was there. I opened it and realized it led to a set of stairs that led to the cellar door outside the house. I felt like such an idiot. I hadn't even had the foresight to check the cellar door when we moved in, since I just assumed it led to the basement. In all the time we'd lived here, I had never even opened it. My bewilderment at the whole thing soon became terror. Someone had literally been living in my house for who knows how long. Things started clicking in my brain. Since moving in, my wife and I had noticed a few weird things that we couldn't explain. Most of the time it was just things going missing. Until that point, I had just assumed my wife had misplaced things, which she did have a tendency to do. This discovery changed everything though. Someone had been living in our house. I had to repeat that thought a dozen times in my head before I could fully wrap my mind around what was going on. I didn't know who had been in there or why, but I knew I didn't want them coming back. I tried calling the previous owners, demanding an explanation, maybe even threatening legal action, but they wouldn't pick up. Either they disconnected their number or they just didn't want to deal with it. Taylor was freaked out, and I was too. That night, I took some heavy furniture and barricaded the cellar door from the inside. I found a heavy-duty looking chain and padlocked it shut for good measure. I didn't care what it took. There was no way I was letting someone sneak back in through that door. The police came and took down a full report before leaving, telling us they'd do their best to try and get in contact with the previous owners. We even called our realtor, who was horrified and said she'd assist the police in any way she could. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard it. There was a loud bang on the front door. Lola shot up, barking like crazy, and we both froze. Neither of us moved, just staring at each other, listening. After a few minutes, the banging stopped, but then we heard small rocks tapping against our bedroom window. Taylor held on to Lola, and I went to look out the window. Taylor begged me not to, but I was furious at that point. In my mind, I was preparing to fight whoever was out there. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and yanked the curtains away from the window, but I couldn't see a thing. We thought it was over. Taylor wanted me to call the police, but there was a little part of me that wanted to handle this myself. I knew the police would scare them away and call it pettiness, but I wanted to make sure whoever was out there got caught. I told her if one more thing happened, I'd call. But then from downstairs, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I sprinted downstairs just in time to see two figures running away from the house. The kitchen window was completely shattered. It was then that I called the police, who showed up not long after. They searched the house and the basement, but there was no sign of forced entry into the storm room. They didn't find anyone on the property either. Their best guess was that whoever had been living down there was angry when they realized they were locked out and decided to come back and scare us. I was both furious and horrified. My wife has been a wreck ever since. The police escalated the situation since an actual crime happened and said they're working on tracking down the previous owners, but that it could take a few days. That was 2 full days ago, and we still have not been able to get in contact with them. I think the police scared away those squatters though, at least for now, as they haven't been back to our house since. I'm actually shocked that something like this could even happen in the first place. If we can't get in contact with the previous owners soon, I have absolutely no idea what I'm gonna do. I'm fully prepared to defend myself, but I hope it doesn't come to that. When I bought my first house, I was only 27. I'd saved up for years, and even though it was just a small, modest place, I was proud of it. Moving in, though, that took some adjustment. I'd lived with my parents my whole life, along with 3 siblings and 2 dogs. The house was loud, always buzzing with life. But this was quiet. Really quiet. That was honestly the hardest part about the transition. The lack of noise. Living alone felt strange, and at first, I wasn't sure I'd ever get used to it. I'm sure anyone who's gone from living with family to living alone knows what I'm talking about. One thing I loved about the house was the tiny balcony on the 2nd floor. Don't get the wrong impression, I don't even know if I can really even call it a balcony. It was barely big enough to stand on, and I couldn't even fit a chair out there. Regardless, I go out there most nights after work to take a break and clear my head. I smoked pretty often, but I hated the smell, so smoking inside wasn't an option for me. The balcony was twice as beneficial for that exact reason. I didn't even have to go outside or leave the comfort of my own home just to smoke. It felt like a luxury. I'll describe the layout of the property so what I'm about to tell you makes sense. The block I lived on was pretty standard, with houses adjacent to each other all the way down. The street behind mine was exactly the same, meaning everyone's house would be sharing a backyard if it weren't for the 10-foot tall fences designating the property lines. From my balcony, I could see over my backyard neighbor's fence and into his yard. You could see the whole place, really. After a few weeks, I realized I'd met almost all the neighbors except him. Come to think of it, I don't think I had ever seen him, let alone have a conversation with him. The guy never waved and never came over. I never saw him in the yard or at the bedroom window. Nothing. It was like he didn't exist. If it weren't for the occasional bedroom light on at night, I would have assumed the place was deserted. I guessed that there was an old person living there since the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in years, and I never heard any sounds from their yard. After another week, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go introduce myself and at least put a face to the name. One Saturday, I walked around the block to his place, expecting to knock on the door and maybe make some small talk. But the house looked rough. Rough was an understatement. It looked completely untouched. The yard was a mess, overgrown with weeds, and the whole place looked like it had been ignored for years. The paint was chipping, some of the siding had been scratched off, and the walkway was stained. The doorbell was broken, so I gave a few loud knocks and waited. Nothing. I felt awkward standing there and started to wonder if maybe the place really was vacant. But then I saw a slight movement behind the window shade. Just a flicker, like someone was peeking out. That was enough for me. Someone was in there, spying on me, but wouldn't open the door for some reason. I turned to leave, when all of a sudden, the door flew open, slamming against the wall like someone had ripped it open in a violent rage. I jumped back, totally thrown off. I whipped around and found myself face to face with an elderly Asian woman standing in the doorway, staring at me. She was short, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her skin was wrinkled, but somehow tense, like she was flexing her face muscles, if that even makes sense. Her eyes were wide, unsettlingly wide. I can't even lie, I was pretty freaked out just looking at her. There was something off about her, like it looked like she was on something. She didn't say a word, just stared with no expression on her face. Eventually, I cleared my throat and introduced myself as her new neighbor. After a few seconds, she said her name was Priscilla and gave me a half smile. And that was it. She didn't even ask my name, she just stood there, watching me. I nodded and turned away, not knowing what to say. I left feeling more unnerved than I wanted to admit. I never heard the door close behind me, but I didn't want to turn around and get caught looking. Later that night, I went out to my balcony like usual, trying to forget about the strange interaction. At that point, I had no idea of the ordeal that I had just gotten myself into. When I glanced over the railing, there she was, that crazy-looking lady from earlier, standing dead center in her yard, looking straight up at my house. She didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there staring. It was one of those moments where you wonder if you're actually seeing what you think you're seeing. I didn't know if I should say something, wave, or pretend like I hadn't noticed her. It was one of the freakiest things I'd ever seen, and I didn't know how to handle it. I went back inside and told myself she was just a little messed up in the head, and that I shouldn't be getting worked up over a harmless old lady. But it didn't stop there. The following night, I saw her again, but this time, she was moving from one window to another inside her house, watching me from each one. Although I pretended not to notice her, part of me felt like she knew that I knew she was watching. I was hoping she'd stop, but she didn't. She was still looking at me when I finished smoking and turned to go inside. Out of curiosity, I peeked out one of my windows about 20 minutes later to see if she was still looking at my house. To my horror, she actually was. I called my dad, and he told me that she probably had dementia or something, and that she was most likely just lonely or confused. He told me that I should actually feel bad for her. It was kind of hard to feel bad for someone who was borderline stalking me, but my dad calmed my nerves and assured me that she was harmless. A few nights passed without anything weird happening. I didn't see her in her yard or at any of her windows. I thought maybe my dad had been right, and was starting to feel glad that I hadn't done something drastic. That is, until one morning, when I found a woman's sock on my side of the fence, just sitting in my yard. I stared at it, feeling a chill run through me. This wasn't just her strange behavior anymore. She'd been on my property. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to confront her, but I was starting to feel like I couldn't ignore it either. I should have called the police right there, but I didn't because I didn't want to create issues with a neighbor. That night, as I was laying in bed, the doorbell started ringing. Not once, not twice, at least a dozen times, one right after the other. I didn't even need to look. I knew it was her. In my tired haze, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was more annoyed than scared. I got up, threw on a shirt, and went to the door, telling myself I'd just ask her to leave me alone. I told myself that I'd been putting this off for long enough, and it was about time I dealt with it. I have no idea why I wasn't scared in that moment. I still look back and cringe at how flippantly I handled the situation. I don't even want to say I was naive, but I can't think of a better word to describe my attitude to it all. The second I opened the door, she lunged at me. She ran full speed at me with a kitchen knife in her hand, her face twisted in rage. She started screaming, yelling something about how I had taken her son from her. I barely had time to process what was happening. I grabbed her arm, managing to wrestle the knife out of her grip, and I pinned her down on the floor. She was easy to overpower, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking as I held her there and called the police. She was still screaming nonsense about her son and told me that she was going to kill me. At one point she tried to bite me, but I wasn't going to let her go until the police arrived. It was the longest 5 minutes of my life. She never stopped screaming or squirming the entire time. When the police finally arrived, they restrained her and forced her into one of their cruisers. She screamed the whole time, and I could still hear her screaming even after they shoved her in the car. I had never been more scared in my life. The police made sure I was okay and told me she'd be sent to some kind of psychiatric facility. I never saw her again after that. This incident still weighs pretty heavily on my mind and has definitely made me a more paranoid and cautious person. I ended up moving out not even a year later.